The paper in my hand said $50, and I meant every word of it. But the woman standing in front of my corral had a way of looking at a man that made him forget his own asking price. "I'll pay double," she said, "if the cowboy comes with him." I near dropped the lead rope. Behind me, the gelding snorted like he thought it was funny, too. "My name's Cole Bannister." And up until that Tuesday morning, I'd never been sold as part of a horse deal in my life. I was 28 years old. My hands were cracked from rope burn. And I owned exactly one section of land outside Larkspur, Wyoming, that hadn't turned a profit in 3 seasons running. The bank in town knew my name better than my own mother did on account of the letters they kept sending. I'd sunk everything I had into that ranch after my PA passed, and everything I had wasn't much. Sometimes at night, I'd sit on the porch step and count the boards that needed fixing and think about how a man could work himself raw and still watch it all slip through his fingers like creek water. So when Miss Adelaide Voss rolled up in a rented buggy with city dust on her boots and money that smelled like it had never been earned in a field, I figured she was just another rich woman come out west to buy herself a horse for sport. I didn't figure on the rest of it. "Ma'am," I said, setting the rope down slow, "I don't reckon I'm for sale." She smiled at that. And it wasn't a mean smile, not exactly, but it had teeth in it. The kind of smile a woman wears when she's already decided how a conversation's going to end. "Everybody's for sale, Mr. Bannister. I'm just being honest about the price." She stepped closer to the fence, and the gelding, ungrateful animal that he was, walked right up to her palm like they were old friends. "I need someone who knows this horse and knows this country. I'm building a herd on my late uncle's land, 40 miles north, and I don't know the first thing about cattle or whether or which of my hired men are lying to me. I need a foreman, temporary, 3 months through the fall gather. I'll pay you a wage that'll make that bank of yours very quiet, and you keep the $50 for the horse besides." I should have said no right then. Every instinct in me said a woman who talked like that, quick and sure and used to getting her way, was going to be more trouble than 3 months of wages could cover. But I thought about the letters piling up on my kitchen table, and I thought about the roof over the barn that was fixing to cave in with the first hard snow, and I said, "You don't know a thing about me. I know you raised this gelding from a foal after his mother died birthing him. I know you sat up nights with a bottle feeding him when most men would have put him down. Old Sully at the feed store told me that, free of charge, when I asked around town for somebody honest." She tilted her head. "I've had my fill of men who tell me what I want to hear, Mr. Bannister. I'd rather have one who tells me the truth, even when it's inconvenient." There was something underneath the confidence, something I couldn't name yet, a tightness around her eyes that didn't match the easy way she talked. I didn't know then that she'd buried her uncle 2 months prior and buried a fiancé back in Boston before that. A man who'd smiled just as easy as she did and walked off with half her inheritance and not a word of apology. I didn't know she'd come west because staying east meant everyone whispering about the fool girl who trusted the wrong man. All I knew was she had cash in hand, and I had debts that didn't care about my pride. "Fine," I said. 3 months. But I run the cattle work my way, and you don't second-guess me in front of the hired hands." "Agreed," she said, and put out her hand like a man would, which surprised me enough that I shook it before I thought better of it. The Voss Ranch, when we rode up 2 days later, sat in a stretch of land so pretty it near hurt to look at. All gold wheatgrass rolling toward blue mountains, and a house that had clearly been built by someone with money and love enough to do it right. But the barn roof sagged in the middle, and half the fence posts were rotted through. And the 3 hired men standing around the yard when we arrived had the look of men who'd been getting away with something for a good long while. "Ma'am," the oldest one said, tipping his hat with about as much respect as a man tips his hat to a fence post. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "This is Cole Bannister," Adelaide said, cool as creek water. "He's foreman now. Whatever he says goes." The look those three men gave me could have curdled milk. I understood then why she'd been so quick to offer double. She hadn't needed a horse handler. She'd needed somebody those men would listen to, and she'd needed him fast. And she'd needed him loyal to her purse, and not to whatever arrangement they'd worked out amongst themselves while the owner was still grieving in a Boston parlor. It took me a week to find out what that arrangement was. I caught the oldest one, a leathery fellow named Grissom, driving off a dozen head of cattle under cover of dark, headed for a buyer 3 counties over who wasn't asking questions about brands. I put a rifle on him before he put one on me, which is the only reason I'm alive to tell it. "You tell her," Grissom spat, "and you'll regret it. Man alone out here. Accidents happen. That a threat. Take it however you like, boy." I marched him back to the house at gunpoint anyway, because whatever else I wasn't a man who let threats decide his actions. Adelaide came out onto the porch in her nightclothes with a lamp in her hand. And when I told her what I'd caught him doing, her face went white and then went hard, and she fired all 3 men on the spot. Right there in the yard, in the cold, with nothing but that lamp light between us. "They'll come back," I told her once they'd ridden off cursing. "Men like that don't just walk away from a good thing. Then we'll be ready." She was shaking, though she tried to hide it, wrapping her arms around herself against the night chill. I should have seen it sooner. I've been so busy trying not to look foolish that I let 3 thieves rob me blind for 2 months. "Ain't foolish to trust people," I said. "Foolish is not learning when they show you who they are." She looked at me then, really looked, like she was deciding whether I was another smiling man who'd tell her comfortable lies. "Is that what happened to you? Somebody showed you who they were." I hadn't meant to say anything about my own troubles, but standing there in the cold, with the lamp throwing shadows across her face, it came out anyway. My PA mortgaged that ranch twice without telling me, gambling debts. Died owing more than the land's worth. I've spent 3 years trying to dig us out of a hole he dug, and every season the bank writes another letter reminding me I'm losing. I hadn't said that many words about it to another living soul. "Guess we're both cleaning up after other people's mistakes." "Guess we are," she said. And for the first time since I'd met her, that easy smile of hers cracked into something real, something tired and human. "Thank you for not looking away when you saw those cattle moving. A lot of men would have looked away for a cut of the profit. I don't work that way." "No," she said softly. "I'm starting to see that." We were down to just the 2 of us and a boy named Pip who did chores for meals, which meant I was doing the work of 4 men through the gather season, and Adelaide, city woman that she was, insisted on learning to do it alongside me instead of hiring replacements right away. She said she didn't trust her own judgment on hired men anymore, not until she'd learned enough to spot trouble herself. I taught her to sit a horse properly, to read weather in a cloud bank, to tell a sick calf from a lazy one. She was clumsy at first and never once complained about the blisters or the cold mornings. And there was something about watching her push through her own frustration, jaw set, refusing to quit, that got under my skin in a way I hadn't planned on. "You're doing that wrong," I told her one afternoon, watching her fumble a lasso for the 10th time. Then show me, instead of standing there, looking superior about it. "Mr. Bannister, it's Cole." She lowered the rope. "Cole, then. Show me." I stepped behind her, adjusted her grip. Tried very hard not to notice how close we were standing in the process. Tried very hard and failed. When the throw finally landed clean around the fence post, she let out a whoop of triumph that startled every animal in the yard and turned to grin at me, with dust on her cheek and pure joy in her face. And something in my chest turned over slow and heavy, like a wagon wheel finding a rut it wasn't looking for. I told myself it didn't matter. She was my employer, temporary, 3 months. Come the fall gather, I'd take my wages and go back to my own struggling ranch, and that would be the end of it. But evenings had a way of stretching longer than they needed to. She'd bring out coffee while I checked the horses, and we'd talk about nothing important. About everything. About her Boston fiancé who'd left her humiliated in front of 200 wedding guests when he ran off with her dowry 3 weeks before the ceremony. About my PA's gambling and the shame of watching a family name go to ruin one bad hand of cards at a time. He told everyone I'd called it off, she said one night, staring into the fire we'd built against the autumn cold. Let them think I was the one with cold feet, so nobody would pity him for being left. I found out later he'd already spent most of what he took. Just gone. Like I never mattered enough to even fight for. Man's a fool, I said, and worse than a fool. Anybody who had you and let you go for card debts or cold feet or anything else wasn't worth the boots he walked out in. She looked up at me sharp, like she wasn't sure if I meant it as kindness or something more. And honestly, neither was I. Not fully, not yet. You say that like you mean it. I generally do mean what I say. It's a character flaw. That got a real laugh out of her, low and surprised. Like she hadn't expected to laugh that night at all. Grissom came back 3 weeks later, same as I'd warned her he would. Except he came with the 2 other men, and this time they came prepared, at night, with torches. Meaning to burn the north barn where we'd just finished storing the season's hay. Revenge for losing their easy money and their pride besides. I heard the horses first, that particular panic in their sound that means fire or wolves. And I was out the door with a rifle before I'd even found my boots. Cole. Adelaide's voice, from the porch, and then she was running too, in her nightdress. Straight toward danger instead of away from it, which scared me more than the fire did. Get back in the house. I'm not leaving you out here alone. There wasn't time to argue. Grissom had a torch raised toward the hayloft, and I put a shot over his head that made him drop it. Made all 3 of them scatter for their horses instead of pressing the fight. But not before one of them, in the scramble, swung a burning brand wide, and it caught the edge of my shirt sleeve, caught skin underneath. I don't remember much of the pain right then, only the cold after. And Adelaide's hands shaking as she wrapped the burn and her voice breaking clean in half. You could have died. Over my cattle, over my land. You could have died, and I would never have forgiven myself. Wasn't going to let them burn a season's worth of hay. That's not, she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again with her voice lower and rawer than I'd heard it. That's not what I meant. I don't care about the hay, Cole. I care about you. She said it like a confession dragged out of somewhere she'd meant to keep it buried. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself I wouldn't let myself feel anything about a man I'd hired off a fence post. Because every time I've let myself trust somebody, it's cost me everything I had. But I don't know how to pretend anymore that you're just my foreman. My arm hurt like the devil, but I barely felt it past the sound of what she'd just said. Adelaide, I've got a failing ranch and a bank that writes me letters like it's a hobby. I've got nothing to offer a woman like you. You've got a spine and honesty and hands that pulled a burning brand off my land without thinking twice. That's worth more to me than every dollar my fiancé ever stole. She knelt beside where I sat on the porch step, careful of my burned arm, and her eyes were wet in the lamplight. I'm not asking you to offer me anything. Cole, I'm telling you what I already feel. And you can do whatever you want with that truth. But I needed to say it before I lost the nerve. I could have said something smart right then, something that matched the moment. But all I managed was, I feel it too. Have for a while now. Didn't think it was mine to feel. She laughed, wet and a little broken, and pressed her forehead against my shoulder, careful of the bandage. And we sat there a long while, not saying anything else. Because some things don't need more words put on them. Grissom and his men didn't give up easy, though. Word got back to us that they'd gone to the county sheriff first before we could, spinning a story about how I'd shot at them unprovoked over a wage dispute. How Adelaide Voss was a hysterical Eastern woman who couldn't manage her own property and had hired a violent drifter to intimidate honest workers. It was a lie built clever enough that half of Larkspur believed it before we ever got a chance to speak. The sheriff called for a hearing right there in the town hall. The whole county invited to watch. And I understood plain enough that this wasn't just about cattle anymore. If those men's story stuck, I'd be run out with a violence charge hanging over my name. And Adelaide would lose the ranch to a court-appointed manager on account of being deemed unfit. And everything either of us had fought for these past months would burn down just as sure as Paisley sizzle that hayloft nearly had. The hall was packed the day of the hearing. Every face in Larkspur crammed onto those wooden benches. And Grissom stood up first with his hat in his hands and told his story smooth as Riverstone. About honest men wronged, about a foreman with a temper, about a rich woman playing at ranching who didn't know violence from discipline. I watched faces in that crowd nod along, and I felt the ground going soft under me the way it does right before a bad fall. Then Adelaide stood up, and her hands were steady, even though I knew, standing close enough, that her heart wasn't. "I've been called foolish more times in my life than I can count," she said, loud enough to carry to the back benches. "Foolish for trusting a man who took my money and my reputation both. Foolish for coming out west alone. Foolish, probably, for standing here now defending a man some of you don't know from Adam." She paused. Let that settle. But I know theft when I see it. Because I've had it done to me before, and I know courage when I see it. Because I watched this man run into a fire he had no obligation to run into. For cattle and hay and land that belonged to me, not to him. Mr. Bannister fired a warning shot to stop 3 men from burning down a season's worth of feed after catching one of them stealing my herd. That is the whole truth, and I will swear to it before any judge in this territory. And if that costs me this ranch, then it costs me this ranch. But I will not stand by and let 3 thieves rewrite what happened to save their own necks. It was old Sully from the feed store who stood up next, unasked, and said he'd seen Grissom driving unbranded cattle toward the county line weeks back, and thought nothing of it at the time, but thought plenty of it now. Then Pip, the boy who did chores, stood up, shaking, and said he'd seen the torches that night with his own eyes from the bunkhouse window. The tide in that room turned like weather turning, slow and then all at once. And by the time the sheriff called the hearing closed, it was Grissom and his men being escorted out toward the jail. Wagon instead of me. I won't pretend the months after were easy or simple, because they weren't. Rebuilding trust in a county that had near believed a lie takes longer than one hearing can fix. And my own ranch still sat 40 miles south with its own debts waiting on me. But when the fall gather finished and the herd was counted and sold at a fair price, Adelaide came and found me by the corral where we'd first struck our strange bargain. That same gelding grazing nearby like he had some notion of the occasion. 3 months are up, she said. Guess they are. I don't want you to go. Cole, I want you here, permanent, not as my foreman, but as something else entirely, if you'll have it. I've got land enough for both our herds if you'll sell that debt-ridden section south and start fresh with me here. I've got money enough to see your bank paid off twice over if that's what it takes. But mostly, I've got a feeling I haven't let myself have since Boston. And I'd like the chance to see where it goes, with you. Without a contract or a deadline attached to it this time. I thought about that fence post, and that $50 horse, and the woman who'd offered double for the man standing next to him, and how strange a road it had been from there to here. You already bought the horse, I told her, pulling her close despite my arm still tender under the bandage. Reckon the cowboy comes free this time. She laughed against my shoulder. That same real laugh from the fire that autumn night. And out past the fence, the wheatgrass moved gold in the evening wind. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't think once about the letters waiting back home. Because for the first time in 3 years, I finally had something worth more than any of it standing right there in my arms, unwilling to let go. And neither was I.